But I would like to ask my panelists to join me on stage. They are Professor Randolph Kent from King's College in London, Janet Lim, former Assistant High Commissioner for UNHCR, and Brigadier General Ung Pak Shen, Group Chief Policy and Strategy at Ministry of Defense in Singapore. Okay, thank you. We have arranged this session for us to introduce further and discuss the theme of humanitarian futures with these three important speakers. We've circulated questions beforehand, so everyone is clear this is not impromptu. And what we will do is I will first ask Randolph a question, then we'll circulate around and then come back to Randolph at the end. We'll see if there's any interaction between the panelists and open up to yourselves. There will be a section on Pigeonhole, so please use it to input your questions on there. It allows us to sense more which are the higher profile questions in the room, so we can address those first. But we will also, if possible, open up to some live questions. So the first question to Randolph, and if you want to use the microphones in front of you for your particular questions. If you could explain and start with your experience directing the Humanitarian Futures Initiative, and perhaps tell us the genesis of it and the key components that we've come to understand.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. And let me just say, this is going to be a 5-minute overview, I think is fine. So let me start, if you take a look at the program, which says, from addressing the immediate humanitarian concerns, drawing lessons from the past. And what I'd like to do in my 5 minutes is give you some lessons that I've learned from the past, my odyssey, if you like, so that perhaps we can then also, from the next question for me, then talk a bit about futures. So let me just talk about my odyssey. And that begins, in one sense, in Bangladesh, or East Pakistan at the time, in the early 70s, where I remember asking a priest who was there, tell me, what was it like? What was the humanitarian sector like? And he said, well, it was pandemonium run riot. And then my next step is, well, we began to have a system. And that system was something so perhaps obvious in 1984 when we had the Ethiopian famine. A famine of biblical proportions, so it was described. But what I take away from that is, what are the boundaries of humanitarian? There was very little sense of where and what humanitarian was. So I remember asking a USAID official, the government wants development assistance. And he said, but USAID cannot give Ethiopia development. And I said, but what do we do about the government's wish? And he said, well, USAID will give emergency aid. So what we're going to call it is development emergency assistance. And so that was forming some kind of structure for the humanitarian, right or wrong. And I do remember, and this is important for the whole humanitarian sector, I think, when it comes to humanitarian assistance, and it was in the Sudan. Southern Sudan was undergoing a very significant rebellion. And we as UN agencies were there to help. So we came to the Relief and Rehabilitation Commissioner and said, what we'd like to do is provide assistance. And surprisingly, he said, yes, of course, provide assistance. We, the government, realize that the UN agencies know about as much of Southern Sudan as we do. But, he said, all we require is one thing. And we all got a bit nervous. And then he said, what we want you to do is just go through one organization. We thought, oh my God, what he's saying is all resources go through the government. And it wasn't. He said all resources go through a single entity in the UN. And all the agencies looked around and said, my God, he doesn't understand what the agencies are like. You cannot have WFP giving all its resources through one UN focal point. So there you have so clearly the individual and separate capacities of that supposedly coherent donor called the United Nations. If I may just then quickly go on to New York City, that was the most difficult crisis of all, as I remember it. And there we were faced with Serbia and upheaval in Serbia. And we didn't know how to handle it politically. So the head of an organization called Department of Humanitarian Affairs, now OCHA, said, this is what we'll call it, because we can't embarrass the government, so we're not going to call it a conflict. We'll call it a complex emergency. And then we then went on, and after New York, this goes, I have 2 minutes left, and this goes on then to probably one of the most traumatic, and what Al asked for, where does my future's focus come from? It was Rwanda, 1994, a genocide as, if you like, as horrific as anything we saw in the Second World War. But we knew what to do to deal with that genocide. We brought in all our standard equipment. We brought in, if you like, our standard procedures. And there we were. But of course, we didn't understand the real consequences, the trauma of a genocide. So what we were providing was standard equipment, but where was the psychological assistance? Where was the social psychological assistance? In other words, what we did was standard operating procedures and not adjusting to the context, which was so amazingly frightening, but we've never had it before. By the way, I can assure you, this led to a very horrible lunch with President Kagame at the time, but that's another issue. Then, if I may just quickly move on to Kosovo in 1999, and there we were, the humanitarian coordinator, myself, faced with extraordinary amount of displacement, but we didn't have the resources. If you like, people were coming across the border, but we had just come there, and what did we have to offer? But it's just interesting to see that the military who were there, the peacekeeping forces, had the resources. And we found that they were dealing with the displaced, less ourselves. We caught up in the end. But the point is, who in this context was the humanitarian? And this is a problem that I think one is going to have to come back to as this, I think, session goes on. Finally, if I may, Somalia, 2000, 2001. And there was a rinderpest disease, and in a country which is dependent upon cattle, etc., that was so very serious. So we called in the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, and other organizations from outside who dealt with this kind of disease, and we needed them urgently to respond. But the response was well-intentioned, but delayed. But what we noticed was that the cattle was being taken care of as they were moving up to the trading areas. And why? Because the veterinarians, Somali veterinarians, were monitoring this and beginning to move the cattle in the right direction. And here the question was, well, how are they doing this? Well, Somalia at the time was probably the best mobile phone enhanced country in Africa. Mobile phones, the Somalis. And one of the problems that we found is, where do you look for innovation? How do you understand the society? How do you understand how the society functions? And we never thought that the Somalis would have mobile phones. And we were wrong. We didn't understand, we didn't know how to look for innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if I turn to Janet, I'm going to put your two questions together. Looking ahead, what are the main challenges you see for preparing for multiple humanitarian futures, and how best can these be overcome? And then second, reflecting on your career in the United Nations system and now your involvement in private philanthropy, what are your key reflections on the humanitarian assistance, humanitarian system, and more recently on private philanthropy, and what do you think are its implications for the future of humanitarian affairs? Janet.
Okay, is it working? Yes. Thank you very much, Alistair, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you in this panel this morning. Now, I want to talk, obviously, from my experience working in the UN humanitarian sector. What Catherine has said is this international humanitarian system, or as she calls it, the IASC system. This is a global system that the world has looked to deliver humanitarian assistance in most of the crises in the world, especially in the last few decades. Since my retirement, I have had the opportunity to work in the area of private philanthropy, and I have gained quite a lot of perspective from that experience, and now I feel I'm able to look at the so-called international humanitarian system from an outside perspective. If we look at the world today, and you see the many difficulties and challenges that the international humanitarian system is facing, I'm not surprised that one of the questions was talking about the demise. I don't know if I've interpreted it correctly, but one is tempted to ask, is this international humanitarian system, this global system that the world has relied on to provide humanitarian action, is it failing? Is it breaking down? And what of its future? So let me just look at two very critical areas of challenge to this international humanitarian system. For me, one of the most critical challenge now currently that we see to the international humanitarian system is its inability to have humanitarian access. Now, without humanitarian access, there can be no humanitarian action. And as Catherine says, the purpose of humanitarian action is to help those people in need who are caught in wars, conflict, and of course, other natural disaster. But this question of access, of course, is the most serious when it comes to situations of war and conflict. I mean, look at Gaza, look at Ukraine, you know, and I mean, if you look at the big major crises in the last few years, you know, Sudan, Ethiopia, and all that, humanitarian access, which used, at least in the earlier part of my career, one could take more or less for granted. It's never been easy, but most of the challenges we faced at that time were logistical ones, not political ones. You know, we needed to overcome how to get through mountainous routes, how to get to places which are difficult to access. But today, you know, humanitarian access is held hostage by the parties in conflict. And often, it has to be negotiated with the parties in conflict. And of course, you need the support of bigger governments, you know, that are allies to the parties in conflict. And so the whole process has become very politicized. So I think this, going forward, you know, I think that this problem will become greater in the future, not less, as we are moving towards a more divided world where there's less consensus among countries. So I fear for this very basic, modus operandi that we need to have in humanitarian action. The second big challenge that I want to address is insufficiency of resources for humanitarian actions. There will be increased crisis, in my view, in the future. And these crises, I mean, there's going to be sort of proliferation of disasters, environmental disaster, health disasters, and so on, because we are, moving into a world where the effect of mankind destroying, what we have is going to be more and more impactful. So the need for humanitarian action, I feel, is going to be increasing. However, the resources that we have, maybe it's not diminishing in absolute terms, but it will never be in proportion to the amount of needs that we have. And so the gap between the need and the requirement is going to be increasing. And this is going to be a problem because we will not be able to reach the many people that we need to reach. Now, when we talk about the international humanitarian system, it is this big bureaucratic machinery. And it is, over time, as Catherine says, is evolving. It was very Western-centric. It was, but there has been some gradual evolution where there has been sort of increased participation by countries in the South rather than only just from the North. So there are some, changes that is taking place. But I feel very much that given the kind of structures that it has, which is based very much on governments, on these big entities, I think there's a limit to what this international humanitarian system can do. And I would like to suggest that going forward into the future, if our goal is to meet as many humanitarian, to meet the needs of as many humanitarian crises as possible, to meet the needs of civilians who are in need of humanitarian action, then we would need to look beyond initiatives and perhaps processes that is taking place and that are developing outside this international humanitarian system. I think there's great need for reform within the international humanitarian system. But you can do whatever reform you like, but I think there are certain structural deficiencies that will be very, very difficult to address. Does that mean that we don't need the international humanitarian system anymore? I don't think so. I don't think that there is an alternative to the international humanitarian system because as a global system, it has the power to mobilize to scale. And scale is something that, the problem of scale is something that we need to address. But what I'm proposing and what I feel is needed really is to look at processes outside of this global system because things like access and raising of resources may not, there may be improvements, but they will never be sufficiently corrected, so to speak. So what I'm arguing for is that, that the international humanitarian system need to look beyond itself to see what other private initiatives can be mobilized, to meet humanitarian needs. And since my engagement with private philanthropy, I have had the chance to learn a bit more what's happening. And I see many, many positive trends that are developing in that sector. First of all, as we all know, that the resources that's available in the private sector today, far exceed that available in governments. Let's face it, there's a lot more money now in private hands than there are in in government hands. So they have a power of mobilization. If the UN were, if the international system were to see them not as competitors, but as a parallel channel. I mean, I used to think that everything needs to come together and all that, but now I'm starting to see that in this very complex world, you know, having parallel system with different comparative advantage may be something that could, you know, help the whole humanitarian sector. I just want to just share some very simple example. You know, the initiative at the private level, in the private sector, cuts across many different levels. But I have been particularly impressed and touched by what I have seen, you know, when there are, you know, sudden humanitarian crisis. And I think of, you know, the period in recent times when we have had like migrants arriving on the shores in Europe. And the first people who responded to these migrants arriving on these shores were not the big agencies and all that, who were still caught up with trying to negotiate with governments, you know, to go to the site where migrants are arriving. But there are these private individuals that are popping up there who just happen to be surplus. They saw what the needs were, and they started mobilizing assistance and delivering immediately. The first responder, I mean, are really those people who are there. There are also, for example, I mean, in Myanmar, as you know, it's very difficult to get assistance to the civilians who are fleeing in conflict. But I've seen, for example, networks, local networks of private individuals who are able to work with communities on the ground, who are able to mobilize local networks and organize through these networks to deliver assistance to those who are fleeing, for example, in the jungle. Before, you know, I think that the big guys, you know, in the international system would look down on these little private initiatives. But I think they're extremely important. And it will be so helpful if the international system were to, you know, be more broad-minded and, you know, think of ways to supporting and nurturing such initiatives rather than, you know, dismissing them altogether. Then, of course, you know, I think this leads in very well to, you know, the realization that we really need to localize our actions, our humanitarian actions much more. And again, within the international system where there's recognition that this is something that needs to be done, yet very little progress has been made since the World Humanitarian Summit. I think there's just an inherent distrust between these global actors and the local actors, because even if they are channeling funds to the local organization, they always insist on it going through an intermediary, such as another international organization, you know, in order to try and improve accountability, as though the local organization cannot be directly made accountable. So I think this is really you know, going against a trend that we really need in the future if we are going to be able to penetrate further into areas where the big guys, the big international organizations have great difficulties accessing. I also see developing in the private sector many, the way philanthropies work is also evolving. I mean, they are more and more getting connected with each other. So they are no longer working as individual. And you know, in the past, when you think about philanthropy, you think about rich individual signing off checks and giving to charitable organizations. They don't work like that anymore. You know, if they're going to be giving money, they want to be involved directly with the action. And the most effective philanthropic enterprises I've seen are those where they start to connect with each other, pool together their resources, and collectively, and they are able to make very big impact. But what they want to do is to curate the projects themselves. They do not want to give it to necessarily to an international organization to be put. And this is where I think, you know, like I know most UN agencies also have looked to now the private sector to supplement their own resource mobilization. But they're doing it in a way that, you know, not understanding that really what private philanthropists would like to do is to work outside the system. So, you know, there's a limit to how much money you can expect private individuals to give to the organization so that, you know, they can use this international system to deliver. So just in brief, what I'm really arguing for is that looking into the future, in order to overcome all these serious problems of humanitarian access, of resource mobilization, we really should be open-minded enough to look at systems that work outside this global system. I'm not advocating for the demise of the international global system because we cannot afford to do that, but we need to have complementary and parallel system, particularly from the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. I'd like to turn to Brigadier General Pakshin. And we've heard now, we've had 3 speakers so far, yourself from the Ministry of Defence, and MINDEF has employed strategic foresight since the early 80s. What are some of the key takeaways from the strategic foresight approach, and particularly thinking, I guess, on or reflecting on what we've heard so far, and then what are some of those takeaways you think can inform the humanitarian sector and all these examples that we've been hearing about the troubles with the system and being able to plan from the future?
Well, thank you, Al, and good morning to all the participants here. As Al said, Ministry of Defence or MINDEF has started using strategic foresight for many decades. We started in the 80s, and MINDEF was the first to employ scenario planning for long-term planning and as a long-term planning tool. This pioneering effort originated in the 80s, as I mentioned, from then Deputy Secretary Peter Ho. Some of you in the foresight world may know him. He suggested that scenario planning as practiced by Shell, at the time, and Shell continues to practice it, could be useful for plans and policy development. And strategic foresight is critical for organizations in the business of looking long-term. And of course, in the military and the Ministry of Defence is one such example, being responsible for developing capabilities that take years, if not decades, to realize. Broadly, in the Singapore government, we have expanded its investment in strategic foresight. We have centralized the futures capability over the years in the Prime Minister's office under the Center for Strategic Futures. However, MINDEF continues to have a dedicated futures unit that conducts regular scenario planning within our strategic review process. And a few years ago, the MINDEF Futures Unit drafted a future scenario focused on climate change and its impact on defense. The scenario sets the context that military will account for about 70% of government emissions in an envisaged future. Figure is said to be extracted from an IPCC report at the time. And the scenario then goes on to highlight that 50 countries have committed to net zero military emission by 2060. This is painted as a plausible development at a certain COP that would happen in the future. In this scenario, militaries find that they'll have significant operational challenges making this energy transition alongside the rest of the world. Militaries that fail to invest in lower emission platforms become the target of public wrath, and that's something that people wearing uniform here may be concerned about. As climate crisis rage globally in the scenario, militaries also struggle to deal with extreme weather conditions. Across every region, militaries are exhausted from the high tempo of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, or HADR operations. And to compound the problem, we expect conflicts to arise over resources, especially if these are depleted due to climate change. Climate-induced displacement and migration could possibly lead to more conflicts. So it's a relatively scary and somber scenario that we have painted in the Futures Unit. And this exercise showed us that militaries will be severely affected by climate change. On one hand, militaries are significant energy users. There will be public pressure to mitigate contributions to the climate crisis, they'll be compelled to become more energy efficient and to reduce carbon footprints. At the same time, its military will need to adapt to a new operating environment, prepare the forces to operate even in extreme and adverse weather conditions. On the other hand, militaries will be involved in even more HADR operations than today, given the increase in extreme weather conditions. It's especially so in Southeast Asia, one of the most disaster-prone regions in the world. Resource-related conflicts will also increase the intensity of humanitarian operations. Greater regional cooperation could be key to a more sustainable tempo of disaster relief from the military sector. Since the scenario planning exercise, MINDEF has incorporated some of these insights into our strategies and plans to ensure real practical outcome. In the area of climate mitigation and adaptation, the Ministry of Defense allocated resources to support the implementation of climate-related strategies. For example, we established the Singapore Armed Forces Sustainability Office in 2021 to drive sustainability efforts. We also set up structures to provide strategic guidance and oversee implementation plans for mitigation and adaptation. Beyond these structures, we also invested resources in smart sensors and data analytics to monitor energy consumption. But we're not here today to talk about what we are going to do in climate change per se, but the impact on the humanitarian sector. So I'd like to focus the rest of my speech on how Foresight work has led MINDEF to review our strategies and plans in HADR operations. To provide some context, and just now Freddie mentioned, we've invested in HADR before this recent scenario plan exercise. The Changi RHCC Center was established in 2014, about 10 years ago. And since its establishment, RHCC has been actively contributing to HADR operations in the region, coordinated deployment, aid, and multinational exercises. For example, recently in May 2023, RHCC helped to coordinate the transport of humanitarian supplies to aid victims of Cyclone Mocha in Myanmar. This was in support of the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, or AHA Center. RHCC's flagship exercise coordinated response, which many of you were involved in the past week, have also helped to enhance HADR response coordination and capacity building in the region. But however, as a result of the scenario planning exercise, we recognize that RHCC will need to change its focus as well. Let me highlight 3 broad shifts that RHCC has taken since then as a result of strategic foresight work. First, RHCC has incorporated climate change considerations in its training, capability development, and operational planning processes. RHCC now hosts climate-related sharing sessions with well-known HADR agencies, such as the Center for Excellence in Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance, or CFE-DM. These sessions discuss the consequences of climate change for HADR and related fields. And in the past week, Exercise Chorus also discussed the impact of climate change in this region and beyond. RHCC will continue to work with partners such as foreign militaries and NGOs to stay updated on the implications of climate change on HADR operations. Second, RHCC has stepped up efforts to enhance civil-military coordination in order to keep up with the projected increase in scale and tempo of HADR operations. Cooperation between civilian and military actors will allow both sides, or multiple sides, to tap on complementary capabilities. Militaries have the requisite manpower, logistics, assets. Civilian authorities have deep local knowledge. Private organizations, including philanthropists, provide important funding and resources. Benefits from such partnerships are not new and should be very obvious. However, we also recognize that civilian and military actors have traditionally been wary about coordinating efforts together. This is due to some level of distrust or broadly differences in the way we organize ourselves and organize operations. RHCC thus intends to build upon its value proposition as a military HADR expert with a wide network of civilian and military partners. Some key partners include the UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, and RSIS, the co-organizers of this forum. RHCC has also renewed its MOU with the Pacific Disaster Center just 2 days ago. RHCC wants to contribute towards strengthening civil-military coordination in the humanitarian sector. RCC will also incorporate such coordination and capacity building initiatives. To promote inclusivity and foster trust for information sharing, RCC has also created platforms for this CIF-MIL coordination to connect more partners together for HADR efforts. For example, RCC has the open web-based Opera Computer Information System, or CIS. This system distributes situation pictures that are easily accessible by civilian and military users across the public, private, and people sectors. Information sharing is sped up to coordinate HADR responses when necessary. In April this year, RCC also co-organized a CIF-MIL Quad course with UN OCHA. It was exceedingly popular, with an oversubscription of over 200 sign-ups for a course limited to 30 personnel. In addition, RCC has stepped up civilian participation in Exercise CORES this year, which concluded yesterday. I know that there are many new participants who are here with us who were new participants for the first time in Exercise CORES as well. So this is a validation from the HADR circuit of our focus on CIF-MIL coordination now and in the future. Third, RCC has moved upstream towards establishing predictive capabilities and enhancing disaster preparedness through technology. This is a shift away from just focusing on disaster response. Not that response is not important, but we think that there's a space for us to think about disaster preparedness. So RCC has incorporated predictive tools in Opera to further enhance decision-making ability in humanitarian operations. These predictive tools hopefully can support climate-related forecasting, predicting the onset of natural disasters such as typhoons. Anticipatory reports are also sent to RCC's network of partners. In the longer term, Opera will be progressively upgraded to better guide decision-making. Planning, operations, and predictive modules will be integrated within its functions. We also aim to integrate spatial mapping technology in Opera to help us better predict damage, for example, caused to roads by natural disasters, and to calibrate and plan the best routes to enter disaster-hit zones. We should continually identify new ideas, capabilities, and partnerships to strengthen HADR operations in the region, to help the people that we all want to help, what mentioned by Catherine just now, people caught in disasters on the ground. To sum up, I would like to share 3 takeaways in our scenario planning exercise. First, involving the right people. Scenario planning has to be applied alongside change management with the right stakeholders in the organizations. And by right stakeholders, we don't mean just the leaders, but also the people doing the planning and the people on the ground who are doing the day-to-day work that will affect the shifts arising from this strategic foresight work. Second, involving the right people at the right time. Foresight work has to involve engagement efforts from scenario planning all the way to strategy implementation. Such engagements are important to gain traction on an issue and to convince people of the need to make it a priority. We must also continue to stay alert to issues that organizations are preoccupied with. Sometimes there are opportunities that we can seize when the conversations at the senior leadership level are talking about a particular topic, and we are prepared in the foresight work to jump on those opportunities and make changes. This is the part that we must play. Third, involving them in the right place. Scenario planning has to provide safe spaces for individuals to speak freely about issues. We often have to deal with strongly held assumptions and mental models, some of which we might talk about today. For example, will HADR missions place unreasonable operational demands on militaries? Should militaries be involved in HADR operations? There will always be trade-offs involved, one way or the other. How we can allow new ideas to surface. For example, confidential interviews. This is a technique that is used very often in strategic foresight work, where people can voice thoughts and reflections that may not align with organizational narratives. So I think that the HFF, where we are today, is an attempt to involve the right people at the right time and at the right place. We have international participants, of course, from public, private, and people sectors. In terms of timing, I don't think that the organizers have planned for us to be in a situation right now where we are facing many conflicts in the world in different parts. But now is the time to review experiences and discuss strategies in relation to humanitarian issues. And of course, this is hopefully a right space for people. Just now we have the networking session, a quick one, and hopefully throughout the time. It's an opportunity for people who would not naturally cross paths with each other, people wearing uniforms, people in the philanthropic sector, people in the NGO sector, to come together and hopefully find common ways to think about futures in the think about problems in the future. Because despite our different backgrounds, we are going to be living in the same world together. Our children will have to face the same problems that if we don't solve together, we are going to pass on to them, something that we don't think we hope. So I'll end on this note. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to go back to Randolph before I open up for Q&A here. And for one final question, really, and a reflection. We've heard from Catherine and from Janet about the humanitarian system, and we've heard about the philanthropic sector. We've also heard from Pak Shun about the use of foresight, and you've been involved in humanitarian futures. So I'm wondering, what is it from your experience, or what are the major challenges for this mindset shift that we seem so reluctant to make in the humanitarian sector with moving towards more strategic foresight?
Thank you very much. Well, 5 minutes to cover all of this. Let me see what I can do. First of all, let me just read you, for those of you who may know Catherine Bettini, former head of the World Food Program, who just came out with a paper a few months ago, funded by Rockefeller with various agencies. And it was called Defining the Path to Zero Hunger. And this is looking at how one deals with a critical issue, and these are her findings. Her findings are: the first challenge concerns the intricate and long-standing silos and of preoccupation with short-term horizons. The second thing that she said was, there is the prevalence of short-term initiatives that address specific problems for a finite time period. Rarely do these projects coordinate with each other. The third thing that the report said was, and what she called perhaps one of the most difficult of the three challenges to overcome, is myopic priorities. Here the report concludes that intense focus on urgent, immediate priorities also inhibits a healthier and more equitable long-term policy preparation. So let me just say my comments, I'll just begin with this. I am intrigued and I'm very satisfied, glad, delighted to see, if you like, Janet's evolving types of engagement. And I think that Pak Shun's whole horizon scanning structure, integrated structure, is just terrific. It's the way forward. But where does Catherine Bettini's findings fit into this? Anyway, so let me put it this way. From my perspective, and this is really just my perspective, we talk about anticipation. I don't believe that, in a sense, the critical factor are the different scenarios that we come with, but it's rather how anticipatory, how flexible can an organization be, and to what extent can it integrate the various types of specializations so that, and this is the second point, the organization can be far more adaptive. So as Catherine Bragg mentioned earlier, you know, it's very difficult to say what might be, but it is the dynamics and the way you structure the organization that becomes the critical factor. So for me, adaptation is critical. And let me just take these 2 points and put them in a personal context. I remember giving a talk, and I was talking about anticipation. And one of the responders was actually, or not one of the, was actually very taken by the approach. And he said, but I have to leave early because I have to go back to work. And my point is, if you think that anticipation is not about work directly, etc., you've missed my point. And adaptation, again, another talk, And someone said, you know, this adaptation and flexibility, why do you think we have a planning department? To which I said, but do the cleaners know? And that really, if you like, just left them furious, because basically all I was saying is an organization to be adequately adaptive has to be an adaptive organization as a whole at every level. So if I may just mention that. I think the other thing that I'd like to mention is this whole question of innovation. And here, if I may, one of the things that I'd like to find is to what extent and where does one look for innovation? I mentioned Somalia way back, where we didn't look for innovation, that we didn't actively do it. I think people here are more than willing to look at different forms of innovation, different sources, etc. Let me give you this, for example, from the humanitarian sector that came out of what is called the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipatory. And why and how would these people offer something which had humanitarian context? Let me just mention three. One thing they came up with was large-scale collaboration. If you take a look at artificial intelligence for all, if you like, the negative aspects, what artificial intelligence was giving, as they saw it, is a far more effective way of collaborating. Do we take that into account? How is that built into our structure? I think the other thing that came out of this was Earth systems modeling. And here, Earth systems models and extensive sensor networks are increasingly becoming sufficiently reliable to enable real-world data predictions about imminent ecosystem changes. Do we take that into account when we look at innovation? And that's also what I'd like to leave with you. I think a third thing that I've picked out of this vast agenda from the GESDA is disease control and early warning systems. And here, what they are now beginning to identify and develop is an integrated global pandemic early warning system, which will be developed based upon technologies that will integrate disease surveillance in humans and animals. Hence, my point is, there are so many innovations out there, but how do we find them? How do we look for them? And how do we incorporate them? If I may just then go on to the issue of collaboration, which I think, if I may, both Janet and Pak Shun just, I think, handled so importantly and so well. I think the collaboration, and I have very little to add to this, but let me just put it in my own words, that I think we have to understand what I think has been called the complexity. I call it the entanglement nexus, that one way or another, globally, we are more integrated and more, if you like, dependent upon our interests, upon others, etc. Now, just to really rile and upset the humanitarian sector, of which I am a part, let me plant the following, with my apologies to some, and that is more and more the drivers of what we call humanitarian action will be mutual self-interest. And I think we have to bear that in mind when we talk about the kinds of interactions, the kinds of motivations, and the kind of actors. And let me now, if I may, conclude with leadership. And here, I think what you've described is really, if you like, important leadership, not only in Singapore, but it spells out elsewhere and ASEAN more generally. You know, I think it was back in the Iraq War, and there was I think the head of the Joint Forces at the time was someone called Stanley McChrystal. And Stanley McChrystal wrote this book called Team of Teams. If you're interested, and let me just mention, he begins to say, what is really funny, we had the most technologically sophisticated army. We had the largest army. We had the best trained army, but we never were able to deal with the enemy. The enemy always escaped. The enemy always beat us to what we were trying to do. And then he said, you know, the problem is our leadership. Because basically we assume hierarchical structures, that ultimately it is the decision maker on the top who has to make the decision. And what McChrystal concluded was no. The decision has to be made at the appropriate level. And what happens is that appropriate level can be anywhere. It can be, if you like, very much at the ground. It doesn't have to and shouldn't depend upon a hierarchical structure. And here is what he said. Ultimately, a leader has to acknowledge that the decision has to be made at the appropriate point and the appropriate location. And if that person gets it wrong, if that sergeant, as opposed to the general, makes a wrong decision, the leader has to be a mentor, does not, if you like, have to condemn what what the person who had made the decision has done, but rather to say, how can we improve this in the future? So I think here, if you take a look at where the humanitarian issues are arising and who has to, if you like, make the decisions about it, then in terms of leadership, organizations too need to change the way they see the leader. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Randolph. We will go straight into Q&A because I see we have a lot of questions on Pigeonhole, so can we have those up on the boards so we can look at them? I encourage you all to vote on these, so given the number, we will be able to see the most popular ones at the top, and then I will go through some of these, choosing the ones which will likely engage each of the panelists. So one question from Pigeonhole is, it seems like some of the issues with preparedness and strategic foresight are due to the age of humanitarian actors. As technologies evolve, the actors do not. How can we do better? I will ask 3 questions, and each of you can respond to the ones that you wish. Some of them are asked to specific individuals. In addition to scenario planning, this is to Brigadier General Ong, what else has been done or can be done to enhance strategic foresight in MINDEF? And the third question is, how does localization go beyond the delivery of aid and extend to influencing decision-making? For example, how many local organizations have ECOSOC status to attend and speak at the UN Humanitarian Affairs segment? So with that, I'll go in the order in which you spoke. So perhaps Randolph, if you just have or do you want me to, I'll come back to you. It looks like you want me to come back to you.
Fine. I just didn't capture all the questions. Sorry. Maybe my colleagues captured them better than I.
Well, I can take a stab at the question that was directed to me. The question, if I understand correctly, if colleagues can surface the specific question, what I understand is what else can be done to improve strategic foresight in the Ministry of Defense, if I understand that to be the question. My sense is there are a few things that are important to make strategic foresight work. One is leadership. I think having leadership that supports the work that is done, especially when strategic foresight is not something that deals with the here and now. There's always this tyranny of the trade-off between urgent issues versus important issues that you can think about, 1 year time, or in 2 years, or in 3 years. And the impact of shrinking workforce is that you want to prioritize your limited manpower to things that will blow up in your face now versus things that may or may not blow up in 10 years' time. I think this is something that we recognize it is an important commitment in terms of manpower for the organization to make. And you require leaders who understand that just as you invest for the short term, you have to invest in the long term, because there are some issues that you cannot deal with adequately if you don't start doing something about it now. So I think leadership, related point is about finding the right people to do foresight work. My experience with foresight work in the Singapore government and in Ministry of Defence specifically is that it takes a different type of people to do foresight. You need people with creativity, which I'm not the best at, but I'm learning. You need people who are willing to push the status quo, because recognizing that scenario is going to be uncomfortable, is going to push for change, requires people to really move away from a status quo's bias. Again, not something that all of us are suited for. Some people are happy to think about things in a stepwise function or stepwise order. It takes a certain kind of people who are willing to challenge assumptions, ask, why must it be like that? Or even if things have continued like that for the longest time, why things cannot change moving forward. So the right leadership in place to support, and the right team of people with the correct type of thinking and the correct type of support to make things happen in the strategic foresight work. I think these are the two things that I think I can share, which could be helpful for the audience. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe if I can turn to Janet with the localization question. It should appear on the screen now.
Okay.
But I'll just briefly recap it. Oh, there it is. How does localization go beyond the delivery of aid and involve more people, basically local leadership and local people in decision making?
Thank you. I think that's a very good question, because localization indeed need not just be about delivery of aid to the population in need. But localization, I think, is important also because the actors are the ones that's closest to the people who are in need. And as Catherine says, if we don't listen to those who are in need, how can we be accurate about assessing their needs? So in order to be able to bring that up from the community, I think they act as a very important voice from the community. And as much as possible, I think that international actors needs to give a space in any forum to listen to these local voices. So it's not about delivery of aid, but it's about also listening to what they know. And it's these communities that really understand how the community works. Often it's not only about what they need, but how aid is delivered, and the cultural context of the aid. So there's a lot that is missed out if all we think about is just bringing aid and dropping it to where they are. There's a lot more that needs to be involved. And so, yes, localization does not only mean the delivery of aid.
Thank you. We've got a few questions now which are gaining a number of votes to do with the situation in Myanmar. And one here we have, which is directed at Janet, but is others perhaps might want to speak on this issue of the politicization of aid within the ASEAN context. So what is it, do you think that the politicized aid will remain relevant? There is another question, so let me just tie these two together on the Myanmar issue. And it's about how to scale up humanitarian resistance. And we heard earlier about Hugo Slim and this idea of humanitarian resistance in cases such as Myanmar, where the national authorities are the primary perpetrators of violence and abuse and have estranged relations with the primary donors. So maybe, Janet, do you want to tackle that first
Yes.
question? Yeah.
So, indeed, the Myanmar situation is a very, very challenging one. And what is not available now is sufficient aid going into areas where the need is extremely dire. As I said, I think that what I've seen now happening is the only actors that are able to reach some of the civilians in need are really these small local community groups who are able to mobilize resources. And there maybe we can also touch on this use of technologies. What is good is that a lot of these initiatives are run by very young people who are involved in these assistance. And they are, of course, very savvy with technology. So they are the ones that are able to mobilize beyond, just the local level. So I'm hopeful that, if we leave it to the young people, if we have more faith in these local groups, they rather than put obstacles, because mind you, very often obstacles are put in their way. And maybe they are doing things in a very informal way, in a very untidy way. But one way or another, they are reaching the people better than any of these big organizations can at the moment. Right now, very little is going through the official channels, I believe, in the Myanmar situation. So I think in the case of ASEAN, obviously the political process needs to continue with ASEAN taking the lead. And I do believe that the regional actors have a much more important role to play than the international actors, because they understand the situation much better. So, we need to be more tolerant about a more untidy situation in the whole humanitarian scene nowadays. There will be governments, political actors, but let's recognize what inefficiency and deficiencies there are in each of these areas of humanitarian action, and let's be more tolerant about informal private initiative, because in a situation of need, let's do whatever we can as long as we can increase aid and the type of help that civilians who are caught in these very difficult situations need.
Great, thank you. We're getting a number of questions which are coming to individual panelists. So what I'll do is I'll group some of them together and ask the individual panelists to respond to them. So for Randolph, I think it's your turn in this. A question here is, given your extensive experience leading Western humanitarian responses, do you concur with the keynote speaker on the end of humanitarian dominance of the West? And a second question was just, would you outline the key components of humanitarian futures?
Yes, fine. Oh, sorry. The Western dominance, the Western dominance of the humanitarian sector. I must admit I agree with everything that has been saying in terms of, if you like, the fundamental change, and I think it was very well explained by Catherine and by both of the panelists here. Let me just go back to, if I may use that question to launch onto something. We keep talking about local. And I'm glad you brought in the next generation, because what I'd like to know about local, if you stand back and say, what is the global system and what are we seeing? I think that we're seeing several things. One, I think we're beginning to see fragmentation among states, which is affecting local, and if you like, creating great discord within local. The second thing that I think you find about local is that if you take a look at the interaction, at trading relationships across communities, what you're finding also more and more is that local is by no means a geographically bound entity. I think a third thing that one might take into account is what you might call remittances. One of the fascinating things about Somalia is the remittances that sustain, if you like, not only the government, but the very structure of the society in so many ways. And then finally, if I may just, my final point on this whole question of localization is virtual. What? Oh, no, but states, nation states, that's what we are. 197 nation states, are we, as geopolitical entities? My hunch is if you take a look at Estonia, for example, that the state becomes more and more virtual. Its dependencies, its peoples, etc., are no longer, and less, rather, geographically bound. Now, what does that have to do with the question and that is, what is Western dominance what is Western dominance? And I'm saying, just from those few remarks, that the very structure, including the multilateral structure, including the UN structure, is, I think, really dissipating, quite sadly, but quite rapidly, and I think one should take that into account. And in so saying, I think what one has to look at is a far more polylateral world, where states, still important actors, are by no means, situation per situation, only the dominant actors. And I think, you know, this must also ring with what you're saying. And the second was from...
Key components of humanitarian futures.
Well, again, the key components of humanitarian futures, from my perspective, is to do things that actually trigger greater flexibility within the organization. I really do not believe that one can anticipate, whether you call them scenarios, frameworks, or what have you, anything that is adequately, if you like, futures-oriented beyond the relative immediate. What you want to do is to get the organization as an entity, as a whole, to think about its flexibility, how quickly it can come together, how quickly it can become, if you like, and make different arrangements. And if I may just put in this context, and again, I think that we set it up here, and that is that part of that flexibility, part of that futures, is taking a look at different networks. For example, how many of your organizations use the International Science Council? How many, if you like, bring that kind of information? Or the Global Systems Network? Do you bring that in? Or is anticipation, and I think you've already answered the question, but perhaps all too often, anticipation is seen as an organizational entity when it should be a trans-organizational experience, exercise, which nevertheless leaves the organization far more flexible, if you like, far more adaptive, far more willing to do things quickly that it never thought it could do before.
Great, thank you. I have a question here for Pakshan. How does the RHCC align its mechanisms with the AHA Center, and what are the gaps and challenges related to the civil-military HADR coordination?
Well, I'll try my best to answer this question, but Freddie will be very much in the loop with this as Director of RHCC. RHCC is a regional organization. It operates within the ASEAN region. It also operates outside. AHA Center is a center that focuses a lot more on the civilian organizations within ASEAN to coordinate for responses within ASEAN. So if you can think about it, if you think about it in terms of a Venn diagram, AHA focuses on the region with a particular set of civilian organizations. RHCC thinks about the military side of the house and thinks about the region beyond ASEAN. So that's the quick and short of it. But given the significant overlaps, RHCC and AHA Center work closely together. So just now when I mentioned the issue about Cyclone Mocha, when AHA Center raised a request from ASEAN for humanitarian aid to be supplied. RHCC is the center that coordinated, that provided the anticipatory report, and subsequently when the cyclone made landfall, provided assessment of what's happening on the ground. And when there was a call for supplies to be provided, they coordinated that supply. So I hope that answers the question on the RHCC AHA Center part. On gaps and challenges, I mentioned the challenges to sieve mill quad earlier just now. That is people coming from different worlds and therefore not quite understanding each other's assumptions, considerations, or even lingo. Things that words that one side use may not be quite understood by the other, or could be thought to be understood but actually mean different things based on different experiences. I think there's also a lack of opportunities for this different groups of stakeholders to come together. So one, recognizing that there are differences in assumptions, differences in background, and second, recognizing there are limitations in how often people from different spheres of life actually come together, talk about the same thing in a way that is in a convivial environment instead of something that is more like a shouting match to each other. So hopefully today we are not going to see as many shouting matches as one could imagine in a crisis situation. Or maybe if you want to have shouting matches, have it here, so that next time, that's something that I mentioned when I was at the opening ceremony of exercise coordinated response as well. We hope to only meet during exercises because we don't hope to have to respond to HADR operations or respond to disasters. But we all know, unfortunately, in the world that there will be disasters, natural or otherwise. So hopefully we have the opportunity where, with opportunities like exercises, like forums today, you get to see each other, you get to recognize each other, and hopefully when the situation comes where we have to work together, people in uniform, people providing money, people providing different types of aid, that you can recognize, oh, I've seen that person before, he or she is not a bad person. He or she is actually working with the same aim and same objective as me in trying to reach out to the people who really need help, and hopefully that will be the kind of platforms and the kind of activities that RHCC and other partner agencies can continue to move forward in order to address the issues that we face with sieve mill coordination. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm going to pose a final question rather than wrapping up myself, because it's been asked from the audience, from James Groves at ANU Futures Lab, and it is and I'll give each of the panelists maybe 1 minute to respond as your concluding thought here. What do you think the dominant theme of the 2033 Humanitarian Futures Forum will be if you use a deliberately and unashamedly optimistic view of the future? And what policy options can we start considering now? And then I will draw this session to a close and hand over for the much needed coffee break for this panel. So who would like to go first? Randolph? And then I'll go to Janet and then Pakshan. Thank you.
So the question is, HFF in 2033, as it looks, if you like, at that period, what is an optimistic view of the world and the way HFF? Well, I think to some extent, the positive sides have already come out, and that is what we are doing now is not becoming continued siloed organizations, but are willing to interact on various levels across various disciplines, recognizing that there is an entanglement nexus in which we are all a part, and that what happens in one area will happen in another. And the optimistic point that HFF will have done is to underscore that this has now been accepted as the pattern of behavior, the trend, and that's actually working when it comes to anticipating and adapting to crises, potential crises. to get in new forms of collaboration and innovative practices that one had never thought of before had it not been for HFF. And that's why HFF, in the most optimistic way, has become, by 2033, a major leader. Thank you. Oh, and just by the way, if I may, if you want to test your capacities for future, there is something on our website called Planning from the Future for your organization as a whole to see how really sensitive are you, how anticipatory and adaptive are you. You might want to try that, if I may.
Sure. Janet.
It's a difficult question, I think, because looking at it from the perspective of today, it's hard to imagine how we could be optimistic 10 years from now. If at all, the tendency will be, more difficult than it is today. But let's just say, okay, let's pretend that we can be optimistic. And I think the most optimistic view I like to have is to see a much more coherent, united world community. Because a lot of the issues that we are struggling with today is because of the divisions that we have in the world today. I don't think that there is an alternative to a multilateral body like the UN, but we need to make the UN a better functioning instrument, and that means that countries are able, to go beyond their national concerns. Without these underlying systemic issues that is causing a lot of problems today, anything else will be difficult to improve, I think, in my view.
Thank you. Pakshan.
Yeah, I think Singaporeans are known to be pragmatic, not optimistic. So that question comes with a certain stress upon how we can think about it. I think touching on what the previous speakers have mentioned, if we can get to a stage where we can be very, very unashamedly optimistic, we can foresee a situation where, just now I mentioned the 3 shifts for RHCC, and I think writ large, I think is applicable for the humanitarian sector, focusing on climate, because climate has an impact, focusing on CIFMIL coordination, where I mentioned briefly just now, and focusing on technology to improve prediction capabilities. And if we can really do all these things well, I think the humanitarian sector can solve bigger problems in the world. Climate is a big problem that I think the humanitarian sector, if you can achieve that level of cohesion, that level of united vision and integration, we can think about. And answering the question on policy options, I think there are then opportunities for different organizations, governments, NGOs, civilian institutions to think about your raison d'être. Just now, Catherine Bragg talks about who you are and why you exist. And if we think then that future of a very optimistic world is going to happen, what is then the role of the government? What is the role of the military? What's the role of your respective NGOs in this particular world? It is, to me, going to be a very happy exercise to imagine that future and work something towards there. There may be something that we need to think about now in terms of being more open to things that we have not done before, being more open to collaborating with people that we traditionally have not thought to be partners. And even if that optimistic future does not happen, I think the desire for us to reach out to new partners, new collaborative opportunities could bring us somewhere closer and address problems that are still going to plague us in the world, climate change and other issues. So hopefully that is a positive outcome independent of whether in 2033 we actually get to that world, because that openness to reach out, that openness to engage more people, hopefully is something that all of us should have as a result of HFF this year. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to bring this session to a close. I think we've had a lot of food for thought, and hopefully now we can distill that over some much-needed coffee for my panelists, which will take place. But let me ask you to join with me in thanking the panelists for their interventions, and again to Catherine for her keynote.
Thank you, Dr. Cook, Professor Kent, Ms. Lim, and Brigadier General Ng for this illuminating session. May I now please invite Colonel Freddie Tan on stage to present our speakers with a token of appreciation, please?